child rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. On Thursday, a lot of things taking place. Of course, the one that is primarily in the news is, of course, the testimony that has already taken place by Christine Blasey Ford, Dr. Ford, and that is now going to be followed up by a response from Judge Brett Kavanaugh. And so in the next hour here, let's see if we can try to summarize some of that. Hearings are taking a break, which I think is appropriate, and then we'll see where this goes from there. But I think you have to understand that as we go through this, there is probably a lack of ability to really resolve this in a way that, say, a court of law resolves this. Matter of fact, one of the pieces I'm going to read in just a few minutes is by Andrew McCarthy. A judicial confirmation hearing is not a trial. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting is that the Republicans have decided to have a woman who is an expert in some of these issues of rape allegations to ask the questions. But because you get 5 minutes and then 5 minutes, there's never a sense of really continuity with the questions. So even if you've been listening to it or watching it, you're probably as frustrated as the rest of us, and probably also at this point just ready for it to be over. But at the same time, I think we need to provide a public service by addressing some of these issues. And a little bit later, I'm also going to read from a piece that is entitled Beto O'Rourke is not getting the Kavanaugh treatment. It's been interesting how the press has been fascinated by every little detail of Brett Kavanaugh, going all the way back to his yearbooks when he was in high school. New York Times has been going over every one of Brett Kavanaugh's yearbooks with a fine-tooth comb. I love what our good friend Gary Bauer says. This is the same media outlet that couldn't find Barack Obama's college transcript. They weren't interested in what church President, or at that time, Senator Barack Obama attended until conservative media outlets exposed Pastor Jeremiah Wright as an anti-American individual, and they didn't seem interested in the more credible and more recent assault allegations against the deputy chairman of the Democratic National Committee, which would be Keith Ellison. So I thought it is kind of interesting. And as we will get into this a little bit later, since we have Texas listeners here, there doesn't seem to be just a lot of curiosity about Representative O'Rourke's actual false testimony at the debate about whether or not he left a scene of a crime, that is, where he was driving DUI, when there is evidence that is both in the police record and in all the people that have testified that what he said Friday night actually did not happen the way he said it did. So anyway, we'll get to that a little bit later, because it just sort of related to this topic in a different way, and of course gets us occasionally off of a topic that will, of course, dominate the news. I did mention Thursday there was something else, and that is the Deputy Attorney General of the United States is meeting with the president today, and where that goes will be something we probably will spend more time talking about on Friday on our weekend edition. But again, you can see what is happening right now, because the individual that testified first is Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. And it was even interesting, as late as yesterday, the lawyers for her were still trying to dictate, for example, which media outlets would be allowed into the hearing. Now, think about this if it were reversed. I mean, if indeed you were bringing in somebody who was going to testify against whoever it might be, a Democratic senator or something like that, you can imagine the hue and cry that would come from the press about the fact that they were going to dictate who would be allowed in to actually be able to carry the particular hearing. And so that one is kind of intriguing. Of course, we also have a couple of others that I might mention real quickly, and that is you have, of course, the one that we talked about just the other day, Deborah Ramirez, who is an individual who actually was at Yale with him and actually said that he may have exposed himself. We've raised some questions about that, and a little bit later I'll spend a little more time getting into the one that was put forward by the lawyer Michael Avenatti, who, of course, has been representing one of those individuals by the name of Stormy Daniels. But this particular accuser, Julie Schwetnick, we'll get into that because actually what she said is that she was at a party, actually a series of parties where women, girls were being gang raped at the parties, claims that she was drugged and raped at one of those parties, does not accuse Kavanaugh of that other than just simply saying that he was there. And, of course, the questions that we can raise, as we will a little bit later, if indeed this happened on multiple occasions and she never told a parent, never told a friend, never told somebody in law enforcement, that one does strain credulity. And Brett Kavanaugh, by the way, has denied all three of these, but this one in particular, he said, this is ridiculous and from the Twilight Zone. I don't even know who this is, and it never happened. So that just gives you a brief summary of some of those particular allegations. And, of course, as we've said before, he is scheduled to testify. We'll hear what he has to say as well. But it is difficult to imagine where he's ever going to be able to get his reputation back. Matter of fact, one of the things we've said from time to time is other individuals who've been falsely accused, not of this kind of thing, but of, criminal activity or collusion or conspiracy or whatever. And, of course, my favorite example happened in the 1980s. Raymond Donovan, who was the Secretary of Labor at the time for President Ronald Reagan, was involved with a company that was brought into a particular lawsuit. And so then his name got plastered everywhere, not necessarily because he was even involved. And it turns out not even was he in an indirect way involved. But eventually, when, of course, he was exonerated, one of his famous lines was, "Where do I go to get my reputation back? Because now that you have plastered my name with all these allegations, it will be probably very difficult for me to ever get my reputation back." And whatever happens in this particular situation with Brett Kavanaugh, I mean, he will have this cloud over him for the rest of his life. Now, if he's guilty, well, then he deserves it. But if he's innocent, and I think a lot of people believe that he has been treated in such an unfair way as to be of great concern. When we come back from the break, though, what I want to do is read from this piece by Andrew McCarthy. We've posted it, and that is Judicial Confirmation Hearing is Not a Trial. Andrew McCarthy is a lawyer, an individual that, again, is probably best known as the prosecutor of the first attack on the World Trade Center, an individual that appears on various talk shows, including he's been on with us as well, in which he actually wondered whether this hearing would ever take place, has actually argued that this hearing should not take place, but also wants to clarify for those of you that have been watching it or listening to it, this is not a trial. And because of that, some of the way the questions are asked, the attempt to try to ultimately find any kind of answers, any kind of truth, provide any kind of exoneration probably will not take place. And we will still be depending on senators to make their best judgment how he or she thinks these particular charges matter or don't matter in terms of an individual that will have a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court. Let's come back. We'll get into this. We'll talk about Representative O'Rourke and his DUI and maybe evaluate a few of the charges that have been leveled. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
During the confirmation hearings for Judge Brett Kavanaugh, we saw lots of protesters screaming outside the hearing room. Senator Dick Durbin declared that what we heard is the noise of democracy. Actually, what we heard was the noise of a mob. And that's exactly what the founders of this country feared. First, we need to remind our citizens that we are a republic and not a democracy. We elect representatives to federal, state, and local governments to consider legislation that affects our lives. This was the intended plan put forth by the Constitutional Convention. And that brings us to our second point. The framers of the Constitution did not want a democracy. They feared that it would be a mobocracy. James Madison defined a democracy as a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person. He went on to explain that democracies have been spectacles of turbulence and contention. Why was he and other founders so critical of democracies? All you have to do is read Federalist Paper number 10 to see that Madison was concerned about how factions could tear a country apart. Wisdom, prudence, and good judgment quickly go out the window when a mob of angry people begins to push for a particular law or policy. The framers established checks and balances to prevent a vigilante spirit that would hastily push forward a wrong-headed policy. That is why it takes so long to pass legislation in America. The framers wanted to provide ample time for reflection and consideration. It was an attempt to tamp down the noise of a mob and carefully craft legislation that would serve all the people rather than just a few people trying to force their will on the rest of us. What we saw this month was not the noise of democracy, but the noise of a mob intent on trying to bully Congress and subvert the Republican form of government given to us by the founders. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Universal 1440, Unbroken, Path to Redemption, the rest of World War II hero Louis Zamperini's true story, now playing, rated PG-13.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, one of the articles we posted here is by our friend Andrew McCarthy. And again, if you would like to read it in its entirety, it's about 3 pages. I'm going to read a fair amount of it because his argument is that this hearing really shouldn't have taken place. Well, it has and will. But nevertheless, I think just hearing him explain what it does not and will not accomplish might help you as you're listening to it, or watching it, or even if you're not interested that much, even tonight when you have things on the news, you watch a talking head show or you open up your newspaper, you're going to have somebody arguing that we didn't really get a satisfactory answer. You think? I mean, that's kind of the nature of the way this is. And so he said, I never really thought that the Ford-Kavanaugh hearing would take place. It did. But again, he argued that it's not going to settle the issue of what, if anything, happened 36 years ago. And so he's saying that's why there's really no point in the hearing. But let's hear him out. He says, Senator Chuck Grassley, the Senate Judiciary Chairman, should just invite affidavits from the witnesses and call it a day. That's, of course, not what happened. But Democrats, in any event, would rather have the specter of Ford's testimony than the real thing, given that the latter will highlight, quote, her inability to recall and relate rudimentary details. And as you've seen some of the questions that have been asked, that's certainly been the case. B, the fact that she did not utter a word about the alleged assault for 30 years. Of course, that came up as well. C, the discrepancies between her current version of events and notes of what she told her therapist. That's already sort of been raised even before the hearing. And then D, the fact that all other witnesses she has identified do not corroborate her story. That came up with the opening statements by Senator Chuck Grassley. So again, we are kind of where we thought we would be before we had a chance to hear her. Now we have a chance to see what she looks like. Now we had a chance to hear her kind of girlish voice. Now we've had a chance to hear a little bit of her testimony. Now we've heard some of her angst. Now we've heard a little bit more about who it was, apparently beach friends, that actually encouraged her to do so. So, we've learned more about who she is, how she sounds, what she looks like, what her story is than what we had before. But nevertheless, let me go back to Andrew McCarthy, says now that Republicans have reportedly retained an experienced female litigator to conduct the questioning, there is no longer the prospect of video clips featuring Ford being grilled by old white guys, grist for the Democrats, because they're going to certainly want to once again emphasize the war on women campaign. Ford's legal team continues to add new demands. The latest is the pushback to have 2 trauma experts and Ford's polygrapher testify. Of course, these were all outlandish proposals, and I don't think any of those are going to take place, but nevertheless, there's where we are. Andrew McCarthy then goes on to say, a few days ago, when Democrats were demanding the FBI be dispatched to investigate Ford's nearly 4-decade-old allegations, I pointed out, and here's a quote from a couple of days ago, even though the FBI has jurisdiction to conduct a background investigation of Kavanaugh, such investigations are not occasions to trigger full-blown criminal investigations of alleged crimes. The Justice Department has no jurisdiction to prosecute, but rather result in flagging of allegations for the Senate's considerations, which, of course, is what has been done. This kind of brings you to a point, before I continue on with Andrew McCarthy, of saying where we are in the process. You have to recognize that there have been a half a dozen investigations done of Judge Brett Kavanaugh. Now, if you're one of those individuals listening right now that think he is guilty, here's what you have to believe. First of all, you have to be furious at Judge Kavanaugh for the fact that he has indeed engaged in this behavior. He has been able to hide it from all sorts of people. Think again, he's hidden it from his wife. He's hidden it from almost all of the individuals that have ever worked with him in his adult life. I can't think of any in his adult life that are still making these allegations. I'll get to one or two questions in just a minute that we've posted. And you'd have to say that he's hidden it from, the 65 women that signed the affidavit saying this is not the Brett Kavanaugh we know. So he's hidden it from his wife, he's hidden it from his colleagues, he's hidden it from everybody else, but really, he's kind of a Ted Bundy kind of guy that has been able to charm individuals and engage in all sorts of outrageous behavior. That's point number one. But back to the point that Andrew McCarthy is making, you have now a half a dozen different investigations by different individuals. These are not done by the same people. These are done by different individuals in the federal judiciary, in the Justice Department, who would then be asking different questions, talking to different individuals, and not one of them has surfaced this. So you would not only have to be upset with Judge Kavanaugh, you've got to, by definition, be upset that we have done such a horrible job of vetting this individual who has served on 2 different circuit courts, including now the D.C. Circuit Court, which is essentially the farm team for the Supreme Court. So you're going to probably pay more attention to vetting an individual going on the D.C. Circuit than probably anywhere else. And none of that ever surfaced. So you've got to be upset with him. You got to be upset with the people around him that were duped. And you got to be upset at least with those individuals that did 6 different background checks and never surfaced any of that. So again, he goes on to say that the FBI inquiry into Judge Kavanaugh's background is not a criminal investigation. The hearings attendant to the nomination are not intended to be a trial. The hearings supplement the 31 hours of testimony Judge Kavanaugh has already provided, as he suggests a form of clearing my name, though he may understandably hope for that, just as one supposes that Ford's for some measure of vindication, but that's simply not the point. The proceedings are about Kavanaugh's suitability to sit as an associate justice of the Supreme Court, period. The objective is to give the Senate, first the Judiciary Committee, then the full chamber, enough information to make a discriminating appraisal of Kavanaugh's legal erudition and character. On that score, the Senate has more information about this nominee, including most significantly the 300 appellate opinions he has authored on the eminent D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, than any nominee in the history of the United States. Let me do a real quick comparison. One of the individuals that is sitting on the court right now as an associate justice is Elena Kagan. We had none of her opinions, and as a matter of fact, some of the information that would have been maybe subpoenaed by the Republicans, because she had worked, of course, in the Obama White House and earlier had worked with others as well, was not even asked for. So if you want to talk about an effective blank slate, Elena Kagan certainly fits into that category. Maybe Sonia Sotomayor fits into that a little bit because she didn't have much of a record there as well. And so when you have an individual where you have over 300 different appellate opinions, to then say, well, we don't have enough information. Yes, we do. We know exactly how he's going to rule on those particular issues. We know the kind of judicial temperament he's going to bring, and that really is what the Senate is supposed to consider in the first place. The Senate is not being asked, he said, to solve alleged crimes. Its job is not to psychoanalyze witnesses. Lawmakers instead are exercising their constitutional duty to provide advice to the president on a nomination and, if appropriate, to consent to a nominee's ascension to office. That's it. Again, this is really kind of what was intended by the founders. When it talked about advice and consent, it would give advice to the president, who had the responsibility to put individuals in various courts, whether it's district court, circuit court, or Supreme Court, as well as various ambassadors and other people in the cabinet, and to provide advice and consent. It wasn't to hold up nominations. Primarily, it looked as if what the framers wanted to prevent is somebody from actually engaging in nepotism by putting, say, their brother on the attorney general's spot, which John Kennedy did of Robert Kennedy. Oh, okay. Or a variety of others who might have put campaign supporters in positions of authority, which Bill Clinton did in a number of ambassadorships. And by the way, George W. Bush did the same later on. But even there, they pretty much allowed the president to do whatever the president thought that he should do. But Democrats said, we've got to change this, and we've got to change the rules, and we've got to first Robert Bork. We've got to then put all sorts of allegations on Clarence Thomas, and of course now we've seen what has happened to Brett Kavanaugh. And this is never what was intended by the various individuals who were supposed to consider these things and provide advice and consent. So anyway, just to break it up a little bit, when we come back, I'm going to move away from the hearings for Judge Kavanaugh for just a minute and say maybe we can learn something as we see how interested the press has been in Judge Kavanaugh and how uninterested right now the press has been in a Senate candidate by the name of Robert Francis O'Rourke, Congressman, because this piece, I think, also illustrates again how there is a tremendous scrutiny of some individuals, oftentimes if they have an R next to their name, and rather significant ambivalence if they have a D next to their name. We'll come back and talk about this particular Senate race in Texas right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continuing our conversation today. By the way, if you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Love to get your thoughts. Perhaps you've already had a chance to hear some of the things that have been said in this hearing. Maybe you have some questions that you would want to put on the table or some observations. Feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. As we always mention, we broadcast on Facebook Live. You want to leave a comment there, I'll check those in just a few minutes and talk about that before the hour is up. Looking ahead, we are going to continue to talk about the hearings today. We'll get a full evaluation of those tomorrow in our weekend edition. But just in about a half an hour, we're going to be talking about this new book, How to Build Children with Integrity. We are later going to be talking about the whole issue of sexual abuse and what people that have been abused actually remember, as we took with Jimmy Hinton, and also a little bit later with Russell Moore, who is with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. So we're going to have a number of guests along the way, but let me for just a few minutes focus on the Senate race in Texas between Representative Beto O'Rourke, or Robert Francis O'Rourke, and Senator Ted Cruz. Now, a lot of the questions that I thought people might have about him and as the individual challenging Ted Cruz is what happened with your DUI. Recognize in the state of Texas there was a big issue about whether or not the former governor, then presidential candidate George Bush, did the right thing with his DUI. And I might just point out that this has a little bit to say about how Beto O'Rourke answered the question Friday night in the debate by not necessarily saying, look, I really made a terrible mistake. I would encourage others never to make the mistake I've made, but instead said, as a white man, I got away with this, and turned it into a whole issue about race almost instantaneously, which wasn't the answer we were looking for, I think. But more importantly, this is about how the press, on some cases, really has been going over information with a fine-tooth comb, to quote again one of the comments people made about how the New York Times has been looking at Brett Kavanaugh's yearbook, and how, to again quote Andrew McCarthy, the media are curiously uninterested in investigating the unanswered questions surrounding criminal misconduct of O'Rourke's past. And so, if nothing else, I want to broaden this, because let's face it, hopefully by this time next week, either Brett Kavanaugh will be confirmed and sit on the Supreme Court, or he will be defeated. And again, maybe there's some lessons we can learn. And one of the lessons we can learn is how, when certain individuals are put forward for the United States Senate, just think about Judge Roy Moore, or put forward for the Supreme Court, think of Judge Brett Kavanaugh, there is an intense amount of interest in their background. And that's, I think, somewhat legitimate, except when there is a curious lack of interest on the part of, and we can use a couple of examples, Keith Ellison, I referred to him just a minute ago, who has served as a representative in Congress and now running for the Attorney General in the state of Minnesota, or in this case, Representative O'Rourke, who is running for the U.S. Senate. And so Andrew McCarthy talks about the fact that in some cases the press, the mainstream press, is sort of like almost an arm of the Democratic Party. But I'll move past that and simply say that Representative O'Rourke has a pair of felony arrests in the mid to late 20s, including a reckless drunk driving incident in which he crashed into a car and allegedly tried to flee from the scene. The cases appear to have mysteriously disappeared without serious prosecution, notwithstanding that O'Rourke continues to deny basic facts outlined in at least one police report. He's going to forget the burglary one, and we're going to focus most of our time and attention on the drunk driving one. So what really happened? We don't know because, as he argues, Andrew McCarthy, Representative O'Rourke is a Democrat. Not just that, O'Rourke is the Democrat running for a Senate seat against Ted Cruz, the Republican independent who is a favorite of grassroots conservatives. Consequently, the press and the Democrats have much more interest in probing other individuals than, of course, probing the background of O'Rourke. Also, as they have not shown much interest in probing the allegations against Keith Ellison, the congressman, attorney general candidate, and deputy chairman of the Democratic National Committee, who has been accused of physically abusing his longtime girlfriend. Let's get back to Representative O'Rourke. He appears to be quite the character, notwithstanding the media's indifference. In the wee hours of the morning of September 27th, 1998, at age 26, by the way, considerably older than Kavanaugh was at the time of his alleged misconduct, O'Rourke lost control of his car while speeding eastbound on Route I-10 in El Paso. According to the police report, after he struck a truck, O'Rourke's Volvo careened through the center median, finally screeched to a halt facing eastbound on the westbound side. Police said O'Rourke attempted to flee from the scene of the crash, but was stopped by a witness who simultaneously had to also warn oncoming traffic of the danger. When he was ultimately apprehended, O'Rourke told police he'd only had 2 beers. In reality, a breath test indicated a blood alcohol level of 0.136, above the legal limit, of course, a fact that police discovered after he slurred his words so badly he could barely be understood and could not pass a simple walking test. The Cruz campaign has asked about the incident, but O'Rourke has denied the police report's allegation that he tried to leave the scene. So did he? Good question. And did he make false statements to police about his alcohol intake after crashing into another vehicle at high speed, luckily not killing anyone? We don't know. His name is not Kavanaugh. He's not a Republican. We are told it is vital to find out what Kavanaugh did and how much alcohol he consumed while doing it. In O'Rourke's case, not so much. By the way, the drunk driving incident is not a one-off, an aberration in an otherwise uneventful early childhood. About 3 years before the car crash, O'Rourke was arrested for allegedly burglarizing a campus building at the University of Texas at El Paso. He reportedly claimed the incident was a college prank, but he was not a college student at the time. Both of these potential felony cases against O'Rourke seem to have been dropped. This is strange, particularly given the seriousness of the car crash and alleged attempted flight. The press is remarkably uncurious about the unanswered questions, seeing that there's nothing to see here, approach to the lack of prosecution. Interesting, O'Rourke's late father, Pat, that would be Patrick O'Rourke, a longtime political ally of the Texas governor, Democratic governor I might mention, Mark White, was a powerful El Paso judge in the mid-'80s, a few years before his hijinks. 1983... can I say this? Yeah, I guess I can. In 1983, a condom filled with white powder, suspected to be narcotics, was found in Judge O'Rourke's car while it was being serviced, but a sheriff captain conveniently surmised that Judge O'Rourke must be a target of a frame-up, dismissed and directed the subordinates to flush the powder down the toilet, and, of course, the matter was dropped. So you go through this list, and Andrew McCarthy has picked up more than even really the Dallas Morning News, the Houston Chronicle. Anybody has been really willing to cover, the Austin Statesman America. But anyway, the question he says is you might also wonder if that's all in the family, because in 2010, Charlotte's Furniture, a longtime O'Rourke family business then run by the congressman's mother, that would be Melissa O'Rourke, pled guilty to federal money laundering charges, specifically to avoiding currency transaction reporting requirements by structuring a $630,000 payment by a single customer. Again, these are things that you would think somewhere would surface in Austin, in Texas, maybe Dallas, Houston, El Paso, whatever. And again, who was the customer who apparently needed $630,000 worth of furniture? Was the customer involved in laundering money connected to some illicit cash business, such as drug trafficking? Because after all, some of that does happen in El Paso. Why was only the O'Rourke business prosecuted? A $50,000 fine, half of which was suspended, as opposed to the business operators or employers who carried out the illegal structure. We don't know. The authorities have sealed the relevant records, and, well, I'll be darned, journalists have just not been curious enough to investigate. Meanwhile, as a first-term lawmaker, O'Rourke skirted a 2012 law that barred members of Congress from profiting on initial public offerings on stock based on information not available to the public. We know that used to be a big problem. We've talked about that on the program as well. And the House Ethics Committee memo warned members to avoid such IPOs as Twitter's. Much to that. And again, O'Rourke, who says he did not see the memo, I love this, bought those Twitter shares anyway, then quickly sold many of them as the stock rocketed higher in value. After he found that Legistorm, the congressional news site, had caught wind of the transaction, O'Rourke fessed up to the Ethics Committee that he engaged in several IPO trades, and the congressman decided to sell those off. That just gives you a little bit of the kinds of stories that really some journalists should be curious about, but they are a lot more curious right now about Brett Kavanaugh than they are about Beto O'Rourke. Just thought you'd like to know about that. We've posted that article for you to read on our website, pointofview.net.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The Islamic Society of Basking Ridge, New Jersey has fought City Hall for the last 4 years. The society hopes to build a mosque in the Liberty Corner section of Bernards Township, ending the 25-mile one-way drive its members must make each day to attend daily prayers. The township has rejected their application 9 times. The planning board held 39 different public hearings over 3.5 years, significantly more hearings on a site plan than any other application to date. Every time the Islamic Society amended their application, the township insisted upon additional requirements. In short, the city buried the society in endless paperwork that no other house of worship had to complete. In November of 2016, the United States Department of Justice sued the township on behalf of the Islamic Society. Less than 2 months later, they won. Those seeking to build a house of worship should never be harassed. It is both unfair and unlawful for a city to require one house of worship to meet certain standards, but allow a different religious body to ignore those same standards. This case will probably be appealed and the challenge will continue, but I hope the Islamic Society will continue to be successful. In a land that values freedom, our government should never make the free exercise of religion difficult. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me come back to the Kavanaugh hearings, and we'll talk more about that as time goes on. But again, we've heard from Christine Ford, and of course, we'll hear from Brett Kavanaugh. But I might just mention, as I talked about just a minute ago, you got Christine Ford. That one has probably the greatest amount of attention. Then you also have Deborah Ramirez as well as Junie Swenick. Let me just mention real quickly why some people have sort of dismissed those. First of all, Deborah Ramirez, she says, I just heard the name Kavanaugh as somebody exposed himself, so maybe it was him, maybe it wasn't. Well, that's not very definitive. And the other one where we're talking about the client of Michael Aventi, again, who has been the lawyer for Stormy Daniels, the porn lawyer. But anyway, Judy Sventic, the questions that are surfacing there are many. First of all, she contends that similar parties occurred nearly every weekend. She contends that Kavanaugh and friends engaged in this activity. She contends that Kavanaugh and Mark Judge obtained alcohol and drugs such as Quaaludes to spike the punch. And she contends that numerous boys were involved in these acts. Of course, she never says he was, but nevertheless, let's at least take a few other issues. This one, I think, that was very well done by Jim Garrity. As far as we know, not a single victim or witness ever called the police. As far as we know, not a single victim or witness ever told their parents, told their teachers, or any other responsible adult. As far as we know, this accuser is the only person who ever attended these parties who has ever come forward making this claim. And nothing related to this multi-year conspiracy to commit repeated acts of ritualized sexual abuse ever came up in 6 FBI background checks or White House clearance checks. I love what Jim Garrity says. This is a remarkable sequence of events, which is why a lot of people aren't really talking about that third case. If you go to our website, you'll notice there are 2 others that I might mention. There's a 4th and a 5th. These are, again, ones where you just have so many unnamed whatever and anonymous sources, it's really hard to take them seriously. But according to this one document that was made available, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse in particular received a call from a Rhode Island constituent saying that this incident took place on a 36-foot maroon and white boat in the harbor of Newport, Rhode Island, after the 3 had met at a local bar. According to this anonymous source, where they learned of an assault approximately 5 a.m. the same morning, he and another individual went to the harbor, located the boat the victim described, and physically confronted the 2 men, leaving them with significant injuries. So that means that, indeed, there was some kind of assault, and these guys beat them up. And so was one of the guys getting beat up, Brett Kavanaugh. Again, I just love what Judge Brett Kavanaugh said. We're dealing with an anonymous letter about an anonymous person and an anonymous friend. His line was, "It's ridiculous, total Twilight Zone, and no, I've never done anything like that." So, again, I've posted that, so you get all 5 of those. But some people at this point start saying, is there a possibility of mistaken identity? Now, Dr. Ford was asked that, and she said, "I'm 100% positive." What'd you expect her to say? Well, now that I think about it, now that I'm here, now that all this has happened, maybe I could be wrong. No, of course not. Matter of fact, I'm going to talk about this in false memories in just a minute. But there is one possibility, and that is the Senate Judiciary Committee, and they're going to reveal this later today, have questioned 2 men who say it was them, not the Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh and his friend Mark Judge, who actually were engaged in the disputed encounter with Christine Blasey Ford in the 1982 House party that led to the sexual assault allegations. Of course, as we know, Judge Kavanaugh has repeatedly denied all the allegations, and the committee has interviewed the 2 men who came forward after the disputed assault at a summer house party. Both told the committee they, not Kavanaugh, had the encounter with Dr. Ford in 1982, and that is the basis of the complaint. And again, we'll see where that goes, but that's part of the issue. And one of the things we're starting to learn more and more about because of these kinds of allegations is what are called false memories. The expert on this is Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, who is a cognitive scientist, law professor who studied memory for more than 40 years. And you know that now more and more we say beyond a reasonable doubt. That phrase is not in the Constitution, but it surfaced in 1798 very quickly and became kind of a legal cliche because it was a way so that individuals testifying would not be then guilty of bearing false witness, basically not violating one of the 10 Commandments and certainly not being accused of lying. But the problem with this is that she has gathered information on 300 people in the United States who have gone to prison for crimes they did not commit, as proved later by DNA evidence. Of those 300, some of whom were in prison for as long as 30 years, and 3/4 of the convictions were a result of false memories of the accuser. I'll just use one example in the interest of time. In 1980s, Steve Titus, this is one that first got her attention, falsely accused of rape, plain and simple. The accusation was a result of misidentification. The victim had picked him out of a lineup. At the time, she said that's the closest, meaning she thought he most closely resembled the attacker. Later in the witness box, though, she stated, I'm absolutely positive that he's the man. Except Titus was sent to prison, then released with the help of an investigative reporter that found the real rapist. I mentioned that journalist won a Pulitzer Prize, but Titus lost everything, his job, his fiancée, his savings, and this is such a sad story. He died of a stress-related heart attack shortly thereafter at the age of 35. So she has, over the years, even been able to implant false memories. During her studies, which were approved by relevant ethics authorities, her team successfully planted in the participants false memories of being attacked by an aggressive animal, witnessing a demonic possession, or even nearly drowning in childhood. And so she's seen how sometimes false memories can really be a problem. By the way, she's not the only one. You have a Harvard psychologist, Daniel Schlachter, who's actually explaining that false memories form partly because our brains are constructive. They create narratives about our future, which can lead to memory errors about our past. Elizabeth Phelps, a psychologist at New York University, reports in a book, Identifying the Culprit, Assessing Eyewitness Identification, that unknown to the individual, memories are forgotten, reconstructed, updated, and distorted. And so I think it is at least possible that both these individuals are telling the truth. I've said that before, and I'll say it again. I do believe that it's possible that she did have something happen to her. These two men may or may not have been the perpetrators, but she misidentified it as Brett Kavanaugh, and I believe that he is telling the truth when he said, look, I wasn't there. Matter of fact, one of the things we've posted is a picture of one of his calendars, which, again, given a high school student, I didn't expect it was going to look really good, but, you know, it shows that in many cases he wasn't even in town when this alleged particular assault took place. So I think it's possible that both are telling the truth, but the bottom line is his reputation is being dragged through the mud. We'll see what he has to say. And of course, we'll be following this and spend a lot more time tomorrow talking about the implications of this, and we'll see whether or not he gets to serve on the Supreme Court or whether his nomination is defeated. We'll think about that and give you a chance to join the conversation along the way. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I'll come back and do kind of a quick summary, then we'll get into our conversation with Karen Budzinski about her book, How to Build Children with Integrity. There's a lot more to cover, and we will do that as we pay attention to what's happening in the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room today. But we need to take a break, so let's do so. We'll come back with more right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. Thursday has, of course, been a very busy day. As you are well aware, there, of course, have been the hearings in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. First, of course, having a chance to hear from Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. Then, of course, we'll be hearing from Judge Brett Kavanaugh. And really, in some respects, we won't be able to cover all of this till tomorrow because we have to hear all of what has been presented. But some of the opening statements that were already brought by various individuals and some of the questions and cross-examination gave us a little bit of a perspective. Senator Chuck Grassley kind of reminded the group before they even got into the hearing about the number of attempts they made to try to provide a favorable forum for Christine Ford to testify, Dr. Ford, and then also how this was all revealed at the 11th hour. So we'll certainly spend some time as we go through this today mentioning it, but also there are just other things to talk about. So in just a few minutes, we're going to get to one of the interviews we had scheduled. And I might just mention, for those of you that are with us in the second hour, Jimmy Hinton is going to be with us, and he's going to be talking about the issue of sexual abuse and how individuals remember or misremember some of that, and some of the questions that have surfaced even in the hearings. And then a little bit later, we'll be talking with Russell Moore, who's the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. So we'll get into some of that as well. But the way the press has covered this is important as well. Our good friend Gary Bauer put it this way, that the New York Times has been going over Judge Brett Kavanaugh's yearbook with a fine-tooth comb. And he said, you know, this is the same left-wing media that couldn't find President Barack Obama's college transcript. They weren't interested in what church Barack Obama attended as a U.S. senator until some of the conservative media outlets exposed Jeremiah Wright and some of his anti-American rants. And they didn't really seem all that interested until fairly recently in more credible and more recent assault allegations against the deputy chairman of the Democratic National Committee. That would be Keith Ellison, who now, by the way, is running for attorney general in the state of Minnesota. It has been interesting to see some of the back-end renegotiations and negotiations, because even yesterday, the lawyers to Dr. Ford were attempting to dictate which media outlets would be allowed in today's hearing. Now, think that through for just a minute. Imagine if it were reversed, if this was some testimony that would actually be critical of Democrats, or maybe something that some of the people on the Democratic committee would have wanted to try to begin to limit the kind of access. You could hear the hue and cry all the way from Washington, D.C. to the other coast. And so, interestingly enough, I thought that was kind of intriguing. Let me just mention real quickly in passing, we'll get to this later, that you have some other allegations. One, of course, is Deborah Ramirez, who was at Yale at the same time as Brett Kavanaugh, but has not really cooperated too much. And there have been some really significant questions that have been raised about what she has claimed, in particular as to whether or not she actually saw Brett Kavanaugh, said she heard his name. Okay, that doesn't help very much. And then you have, of course, Michael Avenatti, who is kind of known as the porn lawyer because he's been the lawyer for Stormy Daniels. produced a third accuser, Julie Swetnick, and that one has really become kind of set aside because of the fact that she says that these women were being gang raped. She didn't say that Brett Kavanaugh was engaged in that, but just that he was there. But again, you have all sorts of questions that surface about, you keep going to these parties. You didn't report this to your parents, to any of your friends, anybody in law enforcement. And so there's just a lot of questions that have surfaced. I also have posted an article talking about so-called fourth and fifth accusers, but again, how all of those have been denied by Judge Brett Kavanaugh. Many of those he's referred to as kind of the twilight zone. If you want to read a little bit on this whole issue, I think one of the best articles we've posted is by Andrew McCarthy, which is entitled "A Judicial Confirmation Hearing is Not a Trial." By now, if you've been watching the hearings, listening to it, or even if you haven't, and you're going to turn on the television tonight or open up a newspaper, go to a website, you're going to be somewhat frustrated because you're thinking, couldn't we finally get a resolution here? Couldn't we assess guilt or innocence? Couldn't we begin to deal with that? But the point is that as Andrew McCarthy, who again is a lawyer and actually has been a prosecutor, he's one that was successful in prosecuting those who attempted the first World Trade Center bombing, has said that really the particular hearing is not going to resolve many of those questions because, as he points out, Dr. Ford on a couple of occasions hasn't given enough information, and he makes 4 points. First of all, he talks about the fact that her inability to recall and relate rudimentary details. Some of that's come up in the investigation that was surfaced before. Also, some of the questioning that was being brought today by the representative for the Republicans, a woman who's worked in this area. Number 2, the fact that she did not utter a word about the alleged sexual assault for 30 years. Of course, that came up as well. Number 3, the discrepancies between her current version of events and the notes of what she told her therapist. And certainly that has been the case. And then number 4, something which Senator Chuck Grassley talked about in his opening statement, the fact that the other witnesses she has identified do not corroborate her story. So he points out that these investigations are not going to generate very much because we already have had basically a half a dozen federal investigations, and so there is not much more that the hearing is going to generate other than to have a chance to hear from both Dr. Ford and Judge Kavanaugh. So those are just a couple of things to put on the table. I might just mention that one of the questions that people have is it possible that both are telling the truth? You do have, for example, 2 men that have now been investigated by the Senate Judiciary Committee who say it was they were the ones who actually were involved in the disputed encounter with Christine Blasey Ford at that 1982 house party that led to a sexual assault allegation. When asked about that, she's convinced that there was no evidence of mistaken identification. She says she's 100% positive. But again, what would she say? Oh, wait a minute, maybe these other 2 individuals were guilty. Sorry, never mind. You know that's not going to happen. So there are 2 individuals, we'll hear more about that today, that the Senate Judiciary Committee have actually received testimony from, and whether this is just a ploy to move Brett Kavanaugh through or whether or not they are the ones that are actually guilty, we'll find out over time, I suspect. And then another piece on false memories. We've talked about this before with Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, who has been able to document now, just in her work, 300 people in the United States who have gone to prison for crimes they did not commit, as proved by later DNA evidence. And of those 300 who were wrongly accused, 3/4 of them, 3/4 of those convictions were a result of false memories of the accuser. So there are certainly some things that suggest that it's possible that both of them, to the best of their recollection, are telling the truth. But the difference is that the reputation of Judge Kavanaugh will be sullied for years, one way or the other. Let's take a break, though. We're going to move on to some other topics and get back to it a little bit later, right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
During the confirmation hearings for Judge Brett Kavanaugh, we saw lots of protesters screaming outside the hearing room. Senator Dick Durbin declared that what we heard is the noise of democracy. Actually, what we heard was the noise of a mob. And that's exactly what the founders of this country feared. First, we need to remind our citizens that we are a republic and not a democracy. We elect representatives to federal, state, and local governments to consider legislation that affects our lives. This was the intended plan put forth by the Constitutional Convention. And that brings us to our second point. The framers of the Constitution did not want a democracy. They feared that it would be a mobocracy. James Madison defined a democracy as a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person. He went on to explain that democracies have been spectacles of turbulence and contention. Why was he and other founders so critical of democracies? All you have to do is read Federalist Paper number 10 to see that Madison was concerned about how factions could tear a country apart. Wisdom, prudence, and good judgment quickly go out the window when a mob of angry people begins to push for a particular law or policy. The framers established checks and balances to prevent a vigilante spirit that would hastily push forward a wrong-headed policy. That is why it takes so long to pass legislation in America. The framers wanted to provide ample time for reflection and consideration. It was an attempt to tamp down the noise of a mob and carefully craft legislation that would serve all the people rather than just a few people trying to force their will on the rest of us. What we saw this month was not the noise of democracy, but the noise of a mob intent on trying to bully Congress and subvert the Republican form of government given to us by the founders. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Universal 1440, Unbroken, Path to Redemption, the rest of World War II hero Louis Zamperini's true story, now playing, rated PG-13.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, one of the themes that's run through the last couple of weeks is, are you a person of integrity? And, of course, Judge Kavanaugh has been certainly lauded as an individual that has integrity. And, again, as parents and grandparents, we really want to teach that to our kids. So I thought for just a few minutes we would take a little bit of a break from the hearings because, again, we need to hear from everybody that will be making that presentation. And we'll get into this in a lot more detail on our Friday weekend edition. So I thought you would really benefit from this book, How to Build Children with Integrity. Karen Budzinski is with us, and she has directed women's ministries for a number of different churches, as well as been a Sunday school teacher. She attended Central Bible College to study biblical counseling and oftentimes speaks to various MOPS groups, is a mother of 5 children, and she and her husband reside in Michigan. So, Karen, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. It's good to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
You know, one of the things that surfaced almost instantaneously in some of the material that was provided by your publisher is a study that was done by the Barna Research Group. And we've had George Barna in studio here. We've had all sorts of other people that since then have taken over for the Barna Research Group. And one of the things they found, interestingly enough, is that we do, as parents, oftentimes talk to our kids about self-control, maybe happiness, patience. But we don't talk about serving others, conflict resolution, the things that sometimes really lead to this idea of integrity, which is why I know you wrote this book, the need for us to have a manual about how to begin to build integrity into the lives of our children and grandchildren.
That's right. I feel that that is a missing link. Even the parents that have integrity, that are modeling it in front of their children. Modeling is different than training. And so the book is literally chapter by chapter strategies on ways to not just model the character, but to train your child to be able to have it.
And, model is important because I've heard, and I've used this phrase many times before myself, that character and integrity and lifestyle and everything is more caught than taught. I mean, kids are like little values vacuum cleaners. They just suck up the values from you. You can talk about honesty all you want, but the first time they see you doing something that they see is maybe not honest, they go, Dad, why did you do that? And so obviously we need to model it, but we need to have some kind of intention in terms of how to teach that. And let me just explain, and Karen, you can help us out here, talk about the book for just a minute, because you've got 10 chapters, which is a good 2/3 of the book. And then you have 7 appendices, so you end up with about a 300-page book. So there's a lot of great material here so that an individual, a parent or a grandparent saying, okay, I'd like to teach this to my kids or my grandkids. I really want to use this, but I don't know where to start. You've really kind of given them kind of a step-by-step, haven't you?
I have, and I didn't want the appendices to take away from just a pervasive view of the chapters. And so I put them in the back for those who really want to go deeper in different areas. It's when you write about children, you're writing about so many various personalities and different character traits that you're trying to, like you can see in a child which ones that they need to develop, which ones they're struggling with. And I wanted this book to be really pretty much an encyclopedia of ideas of how to integrate the follow me and hear from me and watch me, but also how can I impart these things to be part of my children's personalities. For example, if you take your child to the game every week on time and you get them there on time, it really hasn't trained them why you got them there in time. So I want parents to go beyond just doing it to saying to their child, we are going to get there in time because you doing your thing or taking time to catch up with your homework isn't as important as considering the team that's waiting for you. And so by just tweaking what a lot of parents may be already doing or just looking at verbalizing the why behind what you do can become a training for your children so that they can integrate those philosophies and the reasons into their own life.
Might just mention, too, that we have a link to your website, KarenBudzinski.com. You don't even have to know how to spell her last name because we have a link there. There's a trailer about 1.5 minutes long on how to build children with integrity, also one on how to build an enduring marriage. So a couple of great resources there as well. And before we get into kind of the 10 points, let's talk about the fact that there's another very good reason for writing this book, and that is we're in the midst of a, as you call it, anti-Christian culture. So as a result, the values that are caught oftentimes are not just caught from you as a parent who is a Christian or even caught from the pastor or the Sunday school leader, but they're also caught from an anti-Christian culture. And so the bottom line is that, Karen, more than ever, we have to figure out how to counter-program, because if indeed they're picking up their values from the world, we're not going to end up with Christians when they become adults.
I find that is indicative in the statistics for America, and that is why I believe Jesus gives us more power than we even garner in our lives, because one can chase 1,000 and two can put 10,000 to flight. The reason why is because he will multiply our time and our efforts supernaturally, but we still need to spend time giving our children the principles. We need to work harder than ever because a great deal of time they're not even in our homes. So it's more important than ever that we speak of his statutes and principles and ordinances while we're in the way with them. And this is going to give you some great tools so that while you're in the way, in ordinary life, that you can instill things in your children that will stand up against the opposition when that enemy comes in like a flood, we need to lift up the standard against him.
And again, lots of great questions, 10 chapters. Let me get into chapter 1. I can be content with who I am and what I have. You know, the Apostle Paul talks about the fact that I have learned to be content in whatever circumstance I find myself. Let's come back to that verb, I learned. It tells me, Karen, that contentment isn't a natural phenomenon for our kids. And anybody who doubts that, just stand by the checkout counter at a grocery store where all the candy is, and you will hear weeping and gnashing of teeth from some of the kids that want this. So one of the first keys in your book is to really teach your kids to learn to be content. How do we do so?
Well, there's a lot of different ways that are delved into in the book, but the first one is to teach children to say, it is enough. Children are put into our laps, and all of a sudden we want to give them everything. And a lot of parents, they just want to give their children the opportunities they didn't have. They want to give them the Christmases they weren't able to have been afforded when they were a child. And so, unfortunately, we give way too much to children, and at the end of it, I have many parents coming to me with high schoolers, and they're thinking, my child thinks the universe revolves around them. And I take a look at the habits the child has gotten used to, and I say, well, I can see why.
Sure.
I think it's really important not to give your children everything, but to teach them to say it is enough, and to teach them to deny themselves and to be content and not to have everything they see, and to put limits and to not give them things before they even know they want it. I think that we are a overindulgent generation, and as Christians, we know that if we don't deny ourselves daily, that we are not worthy of following after Christ. And the reason why is because if we deny ourselves, we will have more to give, not just financially, but more of ourselves and time to give to relationships and the things that we know that the Lord knows will make us happier and have more fulfilling lives in the end. Materialism is eating up our society. We can see it in the Hollywood principle. If you want to see if money buys you contentment, all you have to do is look at the people in Hollywood that just have so much, and yet it doesn't buy contentment. Contentment is great gain, and we need to give our children contentment with a little so that they have more to give, and they turn around and we can combat these depression statistics for teenagers because of our overindulgent society.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, continue our conversation with Karen Budzinski. And again, the book is entitled How to Build Children with Integrity. We've talked about I can be content with who I am and what I have. We come back, we're going to talk about I am part of a family. I can deny myself. That's another issue that we just talked about. I can work in progress. I am a work in progress. I can get along with others. There's just a lot of great principles in this book, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to feature it today. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about her or the book or her ministry, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Go mobile with Point of View and take transformation with you on the go. Search in Google Play or the Apple Store for Point of View Radio, the Point of View Radio mobile app. Download it free today.
Good news. You are not stuck with your health care plan. Really. You have a choice, and it's a great one. It's called MediShare, and if you've heard about it and wondered what exactly it is, it's a way that people share their health care bills. And these are people who have a common faith, who want to be part of something beautiful that not only meets their healthcare needs, but the needs of others too. And it's people who love to save money, big time. MediShare members typically save $500 a month per family on their healthcare costs. That is a life changer for people. So this could be for you. Maybe it's what you've been looking for, a way to pay healthcare bills that's not only very smart financially, but it's even profound. MediShare is a nonprofit with 400,000 members nationwide who pray for and share with each other. So yes, you're not stuck. There's another way, and it could save you a lot. Find out more. Call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue conversation this hour with Karen Budzinski as we talk about her book, How to Build Children with Integrity. And I think you're going to really appreciate this book. And if you're a parent, grandparent, this is something I really think you need to have on your shelf and to consult on a regular basis. Let me just mention, of course, we knew the Kavanaugh hearings are taking place, and we're continually watching those. And matter of fact, about a half an hour from now, we're going to have Jimmy Hinton on, who has become quite an expert on the issue of sexual abuse, sexual predators, and those kinds of things. So we will be talking with him and, of course, taking your phone calls then. Russell Moore will be with us as well next hour. He is the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. We'll be talking about his book, The Storm-Tossed Family, but also get some perspective as he has been probably best known for his book, Onward, Engaging the Culture Without Losing the Gospel, which was Christianity Today's Book of the Year a couple of years ago, and some other resources. So we will be getting to this topic as well. But again, we recognize that there are certainly other issues to address, and that's one of those that we are addressing today as we talk about building integrity into your child. We talked a little bit about this, Karen, in terms of learning to be content. Another chapter which I thought was really important is I am part of a family. Now, I'm thinking that both you and your husband from time to time say to your kids, you're a Budzinski, you're part of this family. There is this kind of individualism and this self-reliance, but we are part of a family, and that's something else we need to really pass on to our kids, because just as the issue of contentment and materialism are important, selfishness and a lack of identity with a family is another key issue, isn't it?
It is. That's one of the first things that God does with us is he makes us accepted in the beloved. And he puts the solitary in families, he says. And for those that have a dysfunctional family or no family, he gives us the family of God and gives us so many illustrations of how important a family is, and each part of it is. I think a family is important to show you unconditional love and acceptance. In fact, I go into detail in the book about how a family with a father is there to show you the father heart of God. It is actually a parable that we can know how God loves us and how it is to be a child of God, and then eventually when we're the parents, how God looks at us as how we see our children. That's the most beautiful illustration of the family of God. Unfortunately, we've had a lot of abuse, like you were just saying earlier in your announcement. We've had a lot of abuse with things, and now we don't see family as the illustration it was created to be. So we want to get more back to that standard.
And again, one of the aspects of that is learning about unconditional love and all sorts of things that parents can and should communicate to their children. But another part of that, being a part of a family, also relates to the third chapter. It doesn't always have to be about me. This sort of narcissistic culture, let's face it, teenagers are pretty narcissistic anyway. They always have been. But I think, Karen, it's gotten worse with these digital devices in their hands, because now they can update their Facebook page, they can put videos on YouTube, they can put pictures on Instagram, and as a result, it's just reinforced this idea that literally, as you said just a minute ago, the entire universe centers around me. And the bottom line is you want to begin to think of some ways to help them understand that it isn't always about you.
You're right, and even more sadly, I was talking to a teenager yesterday. She's 15 years old, and she virtually had to separate from so many of her friends because not only do teenagers believe it's all about me, the question of who they are is being so attacked that so many of her friends weren't even sure if they were bisexual, things that were just so unknown to me just a short decade ago. The things that our children are dealing with in school are just unbelievable. And so it's really important to give them that solidity in a family, the ability to know that they don't have to be all things to be some things. so that they can be realistic and reasonable in who they are, so that they aren't dependent on the approval of a crowd. For example, I really think when children are small, a lot of parents innocently try to make their kids trendy and cool. And of course, the stores for children's clothing, sometimes children are dressed like little teenagers, and sometimes even, unfortunately, seductively. And they try to make their kids look so cool and to be accepted and to feel good about what they're looking like. And the danger is that if you feed your children and train your children, whether it's innocently or not, when they're older and they're dependent on peer approval, it's going to get them into big trouble in high school. And so those are some of the things that I want to encourage parents to look at earlier before they even are thinking of their child dealing with teenage things. They need to look at how they're training or equipping their children as toddlers to be victorious in their teenage challenges.
Again, the book is entitled How to Build Children with Integrity. And Karen, let's, if we can, talk about I Can Make a Difference in My World. And one of the things I appreciated is that no matter how busy your schedules were, and of course kids can get very, very busy with sports and all sorts of activities and clubs and things like that, you still wanted them to learn to be a blessing. And so this is about giving. Now, obviously, giving is financial giving, although usually young children and even sometimes teenagers don't have a lot of money to give, but they certainly have a lot of time to give. And so whether it's their time, their talent, or their treasure, this is one other thing that we really need to emphasize in a culture which oftentimes does not emphasize being responsible, serving, and instead reinforces materialism and selfishness. So what would you suggest there?
Well, the first thing I taught my children is if something worthwhile is in front of you that you think is a good cause, put something in. It doesn't have to be a lot. It can be a quarter. It can be a few minutes of your time, but put something in. The other thing is balance. It's just not all about your children, not, oh, we have a free day, let's see what you can do. There's different things that you can put names in a hat. I give a lot of ideas. You can put names into a can and pull a name out. Who can we make happy today? Who do you think needs encouragement today? Who do you think you could sit with this week at school that's feeling left out, and give one of your lunch periods to someone who needs a friend instead of just hanging out with your friends? I think those are the kinds of things that we can get our children used to doing. And then when they get encouraged with that and they learn the fun of giving, have intentional giving as well. So you can adopt a nursing home or go read to a grandma or pick up groceries for somebody and overcome the hindrances to think, oh, I'm not together enough to give, or my kids embarrass me. Just keep trying to be a giver and looking for opportunities and teaching your children the joys of it, and they will catch the joys of giving by giving instead of just by observing. They'll be participants in knowing that everything that you give will come back to you 100-fold.
Karen, let's, if we can, also spend just a minute before we take another break on one of the chapters, I am responsible for my responses. And the first point you say is parents better be responsible for their responses. In other words, you need to earn your child's trust. But this is a really big one because now in this world of instant communication, a young person can post a video, a picture, say a statement on a Twitter feed or a Facebook post or an email and regret it for years. So this is something we're really going to have to teach our kids in a world of instant communication. True?
True. And if you teach them that they can be responsible, response-able, and then you teach them how to pause before they put those things out there, how to hear their conscience, how do you develop a child's conscience? How do you teach them to not just register the temperature, but set the temperature, not just to go along with the crowd, but to stand up? Taking that offensive position rather than just defensive will teach them how to take the points. I was privileged to work as a mentor yesterday in one of the Detroit schools with some 8th graders, And this one young girl, I asked them, what would you like to work on as far as to improve your character? And she said, I just have such a bad attitude. So to teach her to say, look that is your choice. Let's flick that switch and let's pretend like your attitude is a light switch. And just if you decide to change it, you can just flick it and purpose to enjoy this day and make the most out of your day. And as far as that instant communication, to think ahead, to not just act in the moment, to pause before you're doing something, that you can learn to hear what your conscience is saying to you.
Good. Flip that switch. We'll continue our conversation on how to build children with integrity right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The Islamic Society of Basking Ridge, New Jersey has fought City Hall for the last 4 years. The society hopes to build a mosque in the Liberty Corner section of Bernards Township, ending the 25-mile one-way drive its members must make each day to attend daily prayers. The township has rejected their application 9 times. The planning board held 39 different public hearings over 3.5 years, significantly more hearings on a site plan than any other application to date. Every time the Islamic Society amended their application, the township insisted upon additional requirements. In short, the city buried the society in endless paperwork that no other house of worship had to complete. In November of 2016, the United States Department of Justice sued the township on behalf of the Islamic Society. Less than 2 months later, they won. Those seeking to build a house of worship should never be harassed. It is both unfair and unlawful for a city to require one house of worship to meet certain standards, but allow a different religious body to ignore those same standards. This case will probably be appealed and the challenge will continue, but I hope the Islamic Society will continue to be successful. In a land that values freedom, our government should never make the free exercise of religion difficult. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Karen Budzinski with us for a few more minutes as we talk about her book, How to Build Children with Integrity. And let's, Karen, if we can, talk about discipline. That comes from the Latin, which means, an instruction or teaching, really kind of a set of rules and regulations. And let's talk about you for just a minute, because discipline allowed you to memorize and play some incredible classical piano pieces. Discipline enabled you to first run a marathon, then to conquer a triathlon, and a number of other things. Talk about the importance of discipline in your life and in your children's life.
I love discipline. It is literally sacrificing short-term wants for longer, more important goals. And if we don't teach our children discipline, we're going to rob them of the beauty of what discipline can get them in their lives. For example, you've got to be able to discipline yourself to eat correctly, social things, spiritual things, go to the right things, and to be a part of a family. There's so many different things that require discipline. Unfortunately, we've linked discipline with an irresponsible use of punishment almost, because if you say discipline to some people, they don't realize how important of a word that is. Discipline doesn't restrict freedom. It gives you freedom to do the bigger things that you want to do by not getting involved in so much fluff beforehand.
And again, some of the very important principles that you can find in terms of discipline as well as setting goals and all sorts of things are in the book. But in the interest of time, let me move on to at least one other topic, and then I want to talk about how people can use this book. But you have a chapter here on I Can Get Along with Others, and that's the important issue of healthy relationships and friendships. And you know as well as I do, because of these digital devices, Karen, young people don't have the close, intimate friendships they used to have because they spend so much time looking at a screen. Now, they're deluded into thinking, well, I got a lot of friends because I got a lot of, quote, Facebook friends, but those are friends with air quotes in the air. And that is really important to begin to and learn how to develop healthy friendships, healthy relationships. And again, that's something where I think we just need to sort of counter-program what is happening in our culture.
It is so important that we teach our children about friendships. Otherwise, they may mistakenly believe that all their schoolmates are their friends, all their likes on Facebook are their friends, like you said. The idea of a friendship should be that you are making that other person's life better because you're in it, and they're making your life better. A real friend doesn't want you to do the wrong thing or something that's injurious to you. A real friend wants good and not bad in your life. It's interesting to me that the word evil is defined as harmful in effect or influence in Scripture. And evil is stuff that will hurt your children. And you want them to learn that and to see that if their friends are leading them to do something that will hurt them ultimately, then they're not a real friend. So it is important that we teach our children how to find a good friend and be a good friend. If someone's not walking down the road with you and is united in purpose, then they are maybe an acquaintance, and we need to teach our children the difference.
One of the things I want to mention is on your website, KarenBudzinski.com, lots of resources, but one of those is you have a class on building better relationships. And so talk about some of the other resources in addition to this book, which are available on your website.
Yes, we do teach a class. I teach a class in my home, Building Better Relationships, and we have women, sometimes we have couples come to my home, and we just work on lifting the bar in your relationships. And every time I try to slack off and maybe take a few quarters off, the girls are pounding at my door saying, we need this class again, because it's just a good workout to not make excuses and to put that character in the front of your shelf so that you remember what it takes to maybe have the power to shut up when you want to say something. I always teach them it's easier to shut up than it is to sweep up, and little things that just brush you off and polish you up so that you can utilize your relationships and bring something powerful to them and use them for the power God meant them to be used for.
Let me just mention, too, that you have nearly 100 pages of appendices. So, again, just a lot of great resources. And let's walk through them real quickly. First of all, Parable of Our Lives. But let me go to the second one, Appendix B, Character Attributes and How to Teach Them. From alertness and attentiveness all the way to the end of the alphabet, which is just phenomenal because, again, there are times in which we hope that some of that gets caught as we go about our day-to-day activities. But if we can begin to be a little bit more resourceful and a little more intentional, all the way, like I said, from alertness to truthfulness versus deception, you've got pages and pages of ways in which you can demonstrate some of these ideas all the way up to issues of virtue and wisdom. So those are, again, some resources that are available, can be taught as maybe a family devotional or just maybe one more character quality. You could put it on maybe your refrigerator and say that's the character quality we're working on today. Then you have a section on powerful ways to develop spiritual strength in your children, which was very helpful. Then a whole issue of church mentorship and mentoring and those kinds of topics, as well as just a whole way of beginning to think through all of these issues. So this is a phenomenal manual that you've put together. And Karen, just before I run out of time, I did mention, of course, that your website, KarenBudzinski.com, has the trailer on how to build children with integrity, but you also have one on how to build an enduring marriage. Talk about that for just a moment.
That's a great resource. People have been using that. I actually taught it at a local Bible college and to young men and women. A lot of women that aren't even in a marriage yet have used it and done study groups together. I have seen literally people divorced come back together after utilizing this material and filling out the workbook. And I can give you about 5 that just come to the top of my mind that were either in the throes of divorce or divorced already that are still back together because they utilized and implemented some of the things in that book. I'm really glad I was able to share some of that. I had one couple recently that said to me, I didn't even know it was possible to live like this, but it's just implementing strategies to be and do what God equipped us to do, but sometimes we don't take the time to look at it. And it's putting it into steps of things that you can take action on, not just read about, but take action on to make a difference.
Well, again, Karen has been with us today. We have a link to her website, KarenBudzinski.com. We also have a link to her Twitter feed and her Facebook page. And, of course, the book is entitled How to Build Children with Integrity. It's about 300 pages, endorsed by a number of people that we've had on the program, and just chock full of information. 10 chapters. We've looked at just a few of those, and then 7 different appendices at the end. So just a great resource available to you. And Karen, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me.
Let's, before we take a break, mention that in the next hour, we're going to get into this idea of sexual abuse and what does a sexual predator look like, and maybe there's some lessons we can learn as we continue to watch the hearings taking place today at the Senate Judiciary Committee. And a little bit later, of course, we will give you a chance to join our conversation. Maybe you have some comments or questions about what you've heard so far. And, of course, we'll give you that opportunity. Jimmy Hinton will be with us as we talk about sexual abuse. Russell Moore will be with us a little bit later. And, of course, we will have a complete coverage of this tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition. Penedexter Kelly Shackelford will be here, and we'll see where this goes. But we'll continue to monitor what is taking place today in the Senate Judiciary Committee for the nomination and confirmation hearings for Judge Brett Kavanaugh. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Protect the health of the nation. Join the Point of View Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team. Pointofview.net/team. Or call 800-347-5151.
Good news. You are not stuck with your health care plan. Really. You have a choice, and it's a great one. It's called MediShare, and if you've heard about it and wondered what exactly it is, it's a way that people share their health care bills. And these are people who have a common faith, who want to be part of something beautiful that not only meets their healthcare needs, but the needs of others too. And it's people who love to save money, big time. MediShare members typically save $500 a month per family on their healthcare costs. That is a life changer for people. So this could be for you. Maybe it's what you've been looking for, a way to pay healthcare bills that's not only very smart financially, but it's even profound. MediShare is a nonprofit with 400,000 members nationwide who pray for and share with each other. So yes, you're not stuck. There's another way, and it could save you a lot. Find out more. Call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View,
and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
So we're going to get back into some of the issues that have been raised in terms of the charges and countercharges and responses. Again, we are talking about the confirmation hearings for Judge Brett Kavanaugh and the testimony that took place today by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. And as I've said before, in a few days, this one way or the other is going to be resolved. Either he is voted into the United States Supreme Court, or he is defeated, and then we move on to somewhere else. But there are some lessons we can learn from some of this, and one of those is how we can be more vigilant about identifying sexual abuse and sexual harassment. Our May issue of the Outlook magazine talked about the hashtag #MeToo movement. We have had Mary DeMuth on this program many times before. We've had June Hunt on the program talking about this. And I wanted to bring another expert to the table today for you to hear from. And if you have some comments or questions, you're free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. Jimmy Hinton joins us by phone. He is a graduate of the Harding School of Theology and is a full-time minister at the Somerset Church of Christ in Pennsylvania. Might mention he was grew up in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. That sounds familiar. Yeah, he grew up about 1 mile from where United 93 crashed on September 11th, 2001. Well, nevertheless, in 2011, a young woman confided to him that she had been sexually abused when she was a young child by Jimmy's father. He was a former minister, and this led to a confession of 23 other victims and a conviction of 30 to 60 years in a state corrections facility. So Jimmy's really been kind of working in this area with some neuroscientists and others, looking at deception techniques that are used by abusers, and even has become a specialist with GRACE, which stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, which is an issue that we have talked about before. Even developed a 20-point predator recognition tool. And, of course, a lot of this is where, of course, he's using the Bible as the foundation for his research so that it can really teach people to understand God's intolerance for abuse, his justice, and his merciful heart towards those who are oppressed and wounded. So, Jimmy, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
I told the story, but are there some other pieces that we need to know? Because this is how, in some respects, because it came from, interesting enough, your own family, an opportunity to begin to research and begin to think through how is sexual abuse and any kind of even spiritual abuse perpetrated even inside the church?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I feel like God has put me in a really unique position. One, because I'm a minister, and I've spent my life studying and teaching the Bible. But then, we had an allegation of abuse come within my own congregation, and so as a mandated reporter, I had to report that. But then, to really just make this really bizarrely unique, the abuser happened to be my own father, and so the person who I was mandated to report was my own dad. And so that, we were trying to process that as a family and just walk through that, and as a church, and really try to understand where God was in the middle of all that. But the bigger issue, and one that I just completely obsessed over, was how an entire family and community for over 40 years missed it. I mean, not one person ever suspected that my dad was sexually abusing children. And not just one, but, he confessed to over 20. And we really believe that he has potentially up to a couple hundred victims. And so that's what really sparked my research in this area, because I lived it. And I went into ministry because my own dad was a minister. And so I'm number 6 of 11 children. And out of a family that big, we all have upper education. And I was the only one who went into ministry, but it was because of my dad's example.
Yeah.
And so, if I had any questions about ministry, he was the first person who I would talk to. So, we were floored. We were absolutely floored that this amount of abuse and how often it was perpetrated went on, and a lot of it right in front of our eyes without us ever noticing it.
Well, and again, this is all happening today while we have the Senate Judiciary Committee. And the first question I'm sure some people listening to this ask is, okay, you are the son of a minister. You yourself are a minister, and you didn't see it happening. Some people are saying, is it possible that a person like Judge Brett Kavanaugh is indeed possibly a sexual predator, and not even his family knew about that? Not even the colleagues that worked with him knew about that.
Yeah, it's certainly possible. I think that's one of the things that I've learned along this journey is most of us think that we're really perceptive people. We think that if we keep an eye out and if we just, memorize these red flag behavior, these lists that identify these red flag behaviors, that all of a sudden we're going to be able to see abuse that's going on right in front of us. The reality is that abusers use highly sophisticated techniques, and a lot of the abuse they do, think Larry Nassar.
Yeah.
Larry Nassar had over 150 victims and their parents come forward who said he was abusing the victims, full on abusing them, while he's having a casual conversation with mom and dad in the examination room. This is not uncommon. That level of abuse and doing it right in front of other people, it's not uncommon to abusers, especially pedophile sexual abusers. It's incredibly common. And so, that kind of led me down a little bit of a rabbit trail that I didn't think would end up turning into a specialized field. But, it's just this concept of abuse in plain sight. Once I started realizing how common it was, I was reading research on this, and I just was left really unsatisfied, because everybody just said, all the researchers were saying, well, it's about control, and the abuser just gets to a point where they're just addicted to control. Well, that's part of it, but as somebody who lived under the same roof as a very sophisticated pedophile, that doesn't tell me how they did it.
Right.
And so, yeah, if it's about control, that's great, but I'm not even concerned with that. I want to know their techniques. I want to know how they pulled this off, where they can full-on assault a child right in front of us and we don't see it.
Well, I'm going to take a break and talk about that. We unfortunately have one of those breaks, and when we come back, of course, you've got this predator recognition tool, and that's where I really want to learn some lessons, because whether this applies today to the debate, it certainly applies to all of us in positions of church leadership. I'm a deacon, and we've had some pastors here as well, and we just say, how do we begin to identify those? And that's one of those issues and one of those tools that I want to talk about when we come back from a break. So we're talking today with Jimmy Hinton. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll have more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
During the confirmation hearings for Judge Brett Kavanaugh, we saw lots of protesters screaming outside the hearing room. Senator Dick Durbin declared that what we heard is the noise of democracy. Actually, what we heard was the noise of a mob. And that's exactly what the founders of this country feared. First, we need to remind our citizens that we are a republic and not a democracy. We elect representatives to federal, state, and local governments to consider legislation that affects our lives. This was the intended plan put forth by the Constitutional Convention. And that brings us to our second point. The framers of the Constitution did not want a democracy. They feared that it would be a mobocracy. James Madison defined a democracy as a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person. He went on to explain that democracies have been spectacles of turbulence and contention. Why was he and other founders so critical of democracies? All you have to do is read Federalist Paper number 10 to see that Madison was concerned about how factions could tear a country apart. Wisdom, prudence, and good judgment quickly go out the window when a mob of angry people begins to push for a particular law or policy. The framers established checks and balances to prevent a vigilante spirit that would hastily push forward a wrong-headed policy. That is why it takes so long to pass legislation in America. The framers wanted to provide ample time for reflection and consideration. It was an attempt to tamp down the noise of a mob and carefully craft legislation that would serve all the people rather than just a few people trying to force their will on the rest of us. What we saw this month was not the noise of democracy, but the noise of a mob intent on trying to bully Congress and subvert the Republican form of government given to us by the founders. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Universal 1440, Unbroken, Path to Redemption, the rest of World War II hero Louis Zamperini's true story, now playing, rated PG-13.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Jimmy Hinton with us, and we're going to be talking about his predator recognition tool. Let me just mention a little bit later, we're going to have Russell Moore with us, president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, Southern Baptist Convention, and so we'll get into some other topics with him. But Jimmy, let's, if we can, talk about how to maybe recognize individuals. And as we're talking about this, people can say, well, how does that apply to, of course, Judge Brett Kavanaugh? How does it apply to my pastor? How does it apply to a youth minister in my church? Because, as you said, this was happening under your purview, under your family's observation, and you never picked up on it. So this suggests to me that for every case that we actually uncover about abuse, whether it's sexual abuse, sexual harassment, whatever, there are many more that are like an iceberg under the water. So can you give us some ideas about how to identify those individuals before we have more victims out there?
Sure. First of all, I developed this thing. Another kind of a nickname for it is the fruits tool. And it's based on Matthew chapter 7 when Jesus says, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits." Then he talks about, are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles. So every tree that bears good fruit, every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. And then he repeats that statement. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. So that created a dilemma within me. And my dilemma was with Jesus. Because Jesus just kind of blurts it out there like this is very obvious. And if people produce good fruit, we'll see it. If they produce bad fruit, we'll be able to see that equally as well. Well, the issue that I had with Jesus was none of us saw it. We didn't see these bad fruits. And so I started thinking through this, and I started speaking with people who I knew were victims of my dad, who were willing to talk. And I began just kind of investigating and saying, okay, at what point did we know that he was gaining access to his victims in order to sexualize them? And was he producing fruit, and what did that fruit look like? And so I had another dilemma. What I realized was that at every single point that he was gaining access to victims in order to sexually offend them, not only were people not kind of having these red flags go up, but the exact opposite happened. All of our guards were coming down, and we were patting him on the back, and we were praising him, and we were giving him accolades. And so that created another dilemma. And then one night, I remember bolting awake in the middle of the night, and it just hit me. And I thought, the reason that we don't see them whenever they're gaining access to our kids is that the fruit that they're producing looks great on the outside, and it looks like fruit that you and I produce. But it's not until we dissect that fruit and open it up and look at what's inside that we realize that it's poisonous. And so that's really what this tool does, is it kind of identifies the fruits that it looks like things that you and I do. But on further inspection, we realize that the motives are that's what's rotten. And so once we realize those things, we can safeguard our children much better. Now, it's not foolproof. I mean, it's not like, you look at this thing and then all of a sudden you're going to see every predator that's out there, but it at least gives us a little bit of a better chance of identifying people and what their motives are.
Now, one of the things you do is you have consulting. So, I mean, if some people are saying, I'm not so sure, I would love to develop this to make sure that our nursery and our church and all these kinds of things, we do background checks and things like that, but sometimes that doesn't work. Is that something that's helpful? Can you give us some ideas of, kind of how you would do that and help somebody that's really asking those questions? Because if there's anything we've learned, it is from the #MeToo movement and from the various conversations we've had with people like June Hunt and Mary DeMuth and others, this issue of abuse and harassment is rampant, and it is happening inside the church. And so we need all the tools we can get to implement immediately, right?
Sure, absolutely. Well, one of the things we need to realize is that we're incredibly vulnerable, every single one of us. And it's when we take a stance where we say that we're really perceptive and that we're keeping an eye out, or that we've trained our church and we've trained our staff and our volunteers, once we start making statements like that, we've increased the vulnerability. We've demonstrated to the perpetrators, and they are watching us. They're watching everything that we do. They're listening to our language. They're watching our body language. I mean, they are constantly watching us. And so, one of the first things that I think we need to do is humbly admit that we're incredibly vulnerable, and to humbly admit that the way that the devil works is that he masquerades as somebody who's a sheep. He masquerades as one of us. And so it legitimately is our best friends, our parents, our aunts, our uncles, anybody could be deceptive. And so once we realize that, I think that gives us a little bit of a better chance of safeguarding our children, because then we realize that, hey, our kid isn't safe with somebody just because we feel like we trust them, or just because they're in a position of leadership. So I want to give people tangible things that they can look for. So obviously I don't have time to go through all 20 of these, but I'll just give you a little bit of an idea. So one of them is education. So education is a good thing. On the outside, that fruit looks good. We should want people to educate our kids. But when you start to dissect this, in each of these fruits, it's kind of similar. You'll find that the person who's the abuser starts being possessive. And so they become possessive and boastful about the education.
Yes.
So they become the only person who can educate your kids, or the best person who can educate your kids. And So they'll speak in terms of needing to educate your kids. And so they'll find opportunities to instruct your children alone. So if it's a Bible study that's one-on-one, or volunteering to babysit your kid and read the Bible to them during church service, when you see things like that, where somebody just seems like they're becoming possessive, or they're speaking of a need to educate your kids, that's not really their say. You know, the parents are the ones who decide when and who educates their kids. And when you have somebody being forceful, or it seems like they're being forceful, they probably are. And so we need to be aware of that. So another one is life skills. Of course, all of us want our kids to be street smart, to just develop life skills, to know how to fish, hunt, drive a car, ride a bicycle. But again, when somebody starts taking your child and describing a need to teach your child life skills, it ought to raise alarms within us. Think Jerry Sandusky. You know, he's going out and he's taking these kids under his wing, but he didn't do it as somebody who was benevolent and genuinely loved kids. He was really possessive about it. And so he would tell parents that he was taking their kids to these games. And if you start looking at these patterns, people start flanking their way in, but because they're doing a genuinely nice deed, that guard with the parents just comes down.
Yeah.
So they think, my goodness, you know, this person's taking my kids out to Penn State games, and you know, they're taking them on these road trips, and isn't this magnificent? But the reality is, the abusers frame it in a way where they're becoming really possessive of those children and of the children's time.
Very good. We're almost out of time, and let me just mention that we have a link to your website, because I think there are going to be people in church ministry and maybe even Christian organizations that are going to want to know more about that. And of course, you can go to jimmyhinton.org, but we have a link there on the website. There's a blog, a podcast, consulting, speaking, all sorts of things. So it's just one more way in which we can try to prevent what has become kind of a rampant issue in the churches. And so it's hashtag Me Too and hashtag Church Too that people are talking about. So I really appreciate you giving us some time today. We're in the midst of trying to assess the truth or falsity of some of these allegations against the judge, but I wanted to broaden it because in a few days that will be just something we talked about in the past, but we'll still be dealing with some of these issues in the church. So, Jimmy, thank you for giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Most definitely. Thank you.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to be talking with Russell Moore. Got a book called Storm-Tossed Family, but also want to get some of his thoughts as the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission on some of the testimony that has taken place today. And, of course, if you'd like to join our conversation at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Of course, we're going to cover it in its entirety tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition. That's what it's there for. And Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford will join me then. Let's take a break. We'll be back right after this.
Go mobile with Point of View and take transformation with you on the go. Search in Google Play or the Apple Store for Point of View Radio, the Point of View Radio mobile app. Download it free today.
Good news. You are not stuck with your health care plan. Really. You have a choice, and it's a great one. It's called MediShare, and if you've heard about it and wondered what exactly it is, it's a way that people share their health care bills. And these are people who have a common faith, who want to be part of something beautiful that not only meets their healthcare needs, but the needs of others too. And it's people who love to save money, big time. MediShare members typically save $500 a month per family on their healthcare costs. That is a life changer for people. So this could be for you. Maybe it's what you've been looking for, a way to pay healthcare bills that's not only very smart financially, but it's even profound. MediShare is a nonprofit with 400,000 members nationwide who pray for and share with each other. So yes, you're not stuck. There's another way, and it could save you a lot. Find out more. Call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Judge Brett Kavanaugh giving his testimony right now. It has been heartfelt and a fair number of tears. And again, we'll do our best to try to summarize some of that tomorrow when I have our Friday weekend edition. Penedexter Kelly Shackelford will be with us, and the testimony is taking place right now. And if you're joining us, of course, we are going to go to our friend Dr. Russell Moore, president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. And that is a group that really provides moral reflection on many of these issues. We've talked with him in the past about his book, Onward, Engaging the Culture Without Losing the Gospel, which, by the way, Christianity Today a number of years ago listed it as Book of the Year. And we are now going to, in just a few minutes, talk about his book, The Storm-Tossed Family, How the Cross Reshapes the Home. It is a B&H book, and of course we have a link to the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission as well as to this book, and you can certainly find it in your local bookstore. Dr. Russell Moore, thank you for once again joining us here on Point of View.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
You know, before we get into the book, and we'll spend most of our time on the book because we really don't know all the testimony, but we've had a chance to hear from Dr. Christina Blasey Ford. Now we're hearing from Judge Brett Kavanaugh. But do you have any advice for our listeners about how to kind of, first of all, think through these issues and to have maybe even some advice and some admonition about how to address this issue? Because on the one hand, it's kind of the issue of the day, but we certainly need to provide compassion, conviction, and even civility in the midst of what has become a very, to use your phrase, storm-tossed of confirmation hearings, ones that I've never seen like before. Any thoughts that you might have?
Well, I think we need to be praying for great wisdom on the part of the U.S. Senate, the Judiciary Committee, and each United States Senator who will have to look at these testimonies and seek to determine the truth. I would also say, though, that what concerns me more is the way that we as Christians talk about this as we're reflecting on it in social media and in every other place. There are a couple of mistakes that we could make, and some of those mistakes will have real-world implications for all kinds of people. On the one hand, there are some people who would say, well, even if this happened, what difference does it make? It was 36 years ago, or she should have reported it, or what have you. When we have women and girls and young men and boys who are listening to us and understanding that sort of language really gives an unfriendly space for people who have been genuinely abused and harmed to speak up and to stand out. And then the other thing is to say we need to understand that we have to have due process, and that's what we see happening today. Is the Senate's looking into these allegations, and I hope we'll do everything it takes to come to the bottom of it. There are people who are falsely accused in our prison systems right now and in other places, and so we really need to turn the temperature down on our kind of herd mentalities and instead listen and seek to discern here.
I would think so. Ed Stetzer's written about some of that in Christianity Today, too. And again, those of you that are in positions of spiritual leadership, again, weigh your words carefully. Be careful what you do say on social media. And, of course, we'll get into some of this a little bit later. And, of course, we'll even talk about it quite a bit on Friday's weekend edition. Russell Moore with us. The book is entitled The Storm-Tossed Family. I guess we'll start off with the obvious one. It is one of the lines from a hymn that you hate, or a song that you hate, but nevertheless seemed like a very appropriate way to talk about some of the issues we address in terms of family, isn't it?
Yes, that line from Place Your Hand in the Nail-Scarred Hand came to me that we would sing often in my home church when I was a kid. And there's the line there about your storm-tossed life. And the more that I thought of that, the more that it seemed to me that's exactly what all of us are living in, a storm-tossed life, where sometimes we feel as though we're just getting our sea legs under us after being tossed in one direction when we're tossed in the other.
Well, and again, one of the things you want to try to do is kind of bring together the cross to the family. Now, if you think about that, when we oftentimes teach about the family, Dr. Moore, we obviously go to Ephesians, but Ephesians is about more than just how to raise your kids. It's also about the relationship between the church and Jesus Christ. And so, in some respects, I'm kind of jumping ahead to one of your chapters. We sometimes make family first, and we kind of exegete out of, for example, the chapter there in Ephesians on the family and make family first instead of really looking at this through the cross. And really, that's kind of the theme of your book, isn't it?
Well, it is, and it's one of the things that bothers me is talking to so many people who have kind of imbibed a sort of discount rate prosperity gospel as it applies to the family. And so somehow we kind of come to believe if we love Jesus and if we just do the right things, that somehow we're going to have this very peaceful and tranquil sort of family life. And then when that doesn't happen, people sometimes wonder, what did I do wrong, or is God angry at me, or so forth. But when Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me, that applies to every aspect of our lives, including our lives in the family, and maybe even more so. Because the passage that you mentioned in Ephesians, you're exactly right. That's not its own standalone section. It's part of an argument that says that God is doing something in the world, summing up everything in Jesus Christ. And the family is a picture of that. Marriage is a picture of the union of Christ and the church. And parenting is a picture of the inheritance that God is giving to his children. And so if that's the case, if God's designed the family to be a picture, then we should not be surprised at all that the family would be an arena of spiritual warfare. The devil does not want that kind of a picture to stand.
And again, we're talking with Russell Moore about this book, The Storm-Tossed Family. But in the first hour, we also had a conversation on a book, How to Build Children with Integrity. And my argument then, which connects up now to this particular book as well, is that if you're taking your cues from the culture, if your kids are taking their cues from the culture, or if the parents are taking their cues from the culture, we're going to have problems. You know, in one of your chapters, you talk about the family as spiritual warfare. When the values are inverted, we've got to really counter-program to the culture. And if that was true in the first century, I think it's still, and even more true in the 21st century, don't you think?
I do, and I think sometimes Christian parents get that when we're talking about issues of, say, sexual morality. But sometimes we don't see how that works in other areas. So, for instance, often I will have parents who are really worried about their children's captivity to technology and access to pornography and those sorts of things by having unrestricted iPhones. And what they'll say to me is, well, I don't want my child to be the only child in his class without an iPhone. Well, regardless of what sort of decision you're making about smartphones in your household, that line of reasoning is going to lead you into some really, really difficult places.
I would think so. You know, one of the other things you talk about, of course, is the idea that we shouldn't make necessarily family first, and yet that's kind of a theme that even sometimes local news shows talk about. But you do say the church as a family. Explain that, because we certainly don't understand necessarily how to put all of that together in terms of both our understanding of parenting and our ecclesiology. Can you kind of help us out there?
Yeah, the Bible uses the language of brothers and sisters, and that's language we use in the church, but I think sometimes we use that language just as a sort of a metaphor for friend or neighbor, when the Scripture is meaning that much more radically. We really have come into a household and into a family, and we really do belong to one another. So what we need are to be genuinely siblings within the church, and we need to also understand that we need mothers and fathers within the church. You know, the Bible uses that language repeatedly, especially in Paul's letters, talking about men being fathers to others and women being mothers within the context of the church. We need that. I think that's one of the reasons why sometimes people are thrown at different life stages in their lives, especially in this kind of hypermobile sort of world where often people are not around extended family. And then their kids are small, or they go through midlife or menopause or whatever it is. and they don't have someone in their life who's been through those stages, who's able to help disciple them through it. And when we don't know what's coming for us, then we can be in really difficult situation.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue with Dr. Russell Moore for just a few more minutes. The book is entitled The Storm-Tossed Family, How the Cross Reshapes the Home. It is published by B&H Publishing. Probably can find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link so you can get it both in hardback and Kindle. 14 chapters that we will focus on. And while I'm mentioning that, we also have a link to russellmoore.com. Now, there's a lot of great material there, including an article he just posted, the story behind the cover of my new book, which I think you'll kind of enjoy there as well. And so you have information about him there. Also, of course, we have a link to his Twitter feed and Facebook page. It's all available on our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Russell Moore right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The Islamic Society of Basking Ridge, New Jersey has fought City Hall for the last 4 years. The society hopes to build a mosque in the Liberty Corner section of Bernards Township, ending the 25-mile one-way drive its members must make each day to attend daily prayers. The township has rejected their application 9 times. The planning board held 39 different public hearings over 3.5 years, significantly more hearings on a site plan than any other application to date. Every time the Islamic Society amended their application, the township insisted upon additional requirements. In short, the city buried the society in endless paperwork that no other house of worship had to complete. In November of 2016, the United States Department of Justice sued the township on behalf of the Islamic Society. Less than 2 months later, they won. Those seeking to build a house of worship should never be harassed. It is both unfair and unlawful for a city to require one house of worship to meet certain standards, but allow a different religious body to ignore those same standards. This case will probably be appealed and the challenge will continue, but I hope the Islamic Society will continue to be successful. In a land that values freedom, our government should never make the free exercise of religion difficult. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Good book out by Dr. Russell Moore, The Storm-Tossed Family, How the Cross Reshapes the Home. I think you will really appreciate that. You'll learn a lot about him, including what his favorite holiday is. It's not maybe necessarily the one you would have expected. But, Dr. Moore, let's, if we can, maybe talk about a couple of the chapters, which I was so glad you included, one on reclaiming sexuality and one on divorce. Those are topics I've addressed in my book, Christian Ethics in Plain Language, but there are topics which the church oftentimes avoids, which maybe is part of the reason we're in the mess that we are. Talk about that for just a minute. How do we think about family and the cross and sexuality and put that together in a way that's God-honoring?
Well, I think one of those things is by being clear when it comes to these issues, to be people of both truth and grace. And I think sometimes what tends to happen is we sort of reverse what the New Testament teaches us to do, which is to say we don't hold the outside world accountable. We hold those who are within the church accountable. Sometimes it's easy to denounce the sins that least tempt our people and to sort of cover over those that do. And I think one of the things that happens is when we avoid those topics, we end up with people with burdened down consciences. So, for instance, I've found that there are a lot of marriages that are really burdened down by sexual immorality, not adultery happening within the marriage, but sexual immorality between the now husband and wife that happened before the marriage that was never resolved. It was never confessed and repented of.
Yes.
And so you end up with that being a burden that still weighs people down. And so it's not gracious to simply avoid these topics. What's gracious is to come in and talk about them honestly, but talk about them in light of the cross.
Well, again, almost 30 pages on that chapter on sexuality. And just again, I think it'd be really helpful for those of you that are in ministry in particular. If you're a small group leader, maybe a Bible fellowship leader, a pastor, I think you would benefit from that as well. And again, let me commend you for Chapter 9, The Road to and from Divorce. It is, again, one of those topics that isn't addressed very often. I remember when I was teaching at a seminary years ago, that I started paying attention to the pronouns, because when we first started doing that in the early 1980s, I know I'm much older than you are, they would talk about their divorce issue. And then pretty soon I started hearing some of the pastors that would come in for like a D-Min program talking about our divorce issue. And then all of a sudden, because there were too many divorces inside the church, pastors wouldn't address the issue. And that's another issue that we certainly need to address. I know that at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission you have, but again, I appreciate the fact that you put that chapter in your book as well.
Well, thank you. I do think that often sometimes church leaders are afraid to talk about divorce because there are so many divorced people in our churches. But actually, one of the things that I've found is that people who have lived through divorce are often the ones who are the most committed to what the Bible teaches about the covenant of marriage, because they've experienced the other. They know that this isn't just the simple fix that sometimes the culture would have us believe.
Well, again, just before we run out of time, I thought we'd talk about the fact that you have chapters here about children are a blessing, not a burden, parenting with the end in view. Of course, you have 5 sons. I love at one point you said, because of that, we've had to have the talk many times. But again, as a father of 5 sons, speak to this issue of children and parenting, because, again, the culture tends to see children as a burden. They're a financial obligation. As a matter of fact, people that are secular tend to have very few children. There's almost a fertility gap between the secular world and the Christian world. But even in the Christian world, we need to come back to some of these key principles about the fact that children are a blessing and a gift from God.
Yes, I titled that chapter, Children Are a Blessing, Not a Burden, and actually that's not really right. If I were being accurate, I would say children are a burden and a blessing, because in Scripture, burdens are often blessings. Blessings often are to be born as sometimes burdens, because a friend of mine told me one time, he said, I knew that parenting would be humbling. I just didn't know it would be humiliating. And parenting is humiliating because it ultimately reminds us that our expertise is not enough. But that's where God wants to get us.
Well, just before we run out of time, I wanted to give you a chance. First of all, we have a link to your website, russellmoore.com. And then, of course, you can also go to ERLIC, which stands for Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which, of course, is the commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. And ERLIC is kind of the moral and public policy entity. And talk about what is available on some of these websites. And in addition to the book, which is available, and we have links there, and people can find it in your local bookstore, talk about some of the other things that are available through your website and through the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission.
Well, there are resources on any number of issues that people grapple with when it comes to moral and ethical decisions. Everything from how do I talk to my child about the transgender question, all the way over to what do we do about living wills and end-of-life sorts of concerns? How do we think about racial reconciliation or orphan care? How do we minister to women and men in our communities who have been part of abortions? How do we preach both truth and grace there? All of those issues will be covered on the website.
Well, again, Dr. Russell Moore has been with us, and let me commend to you the earlier book, which again was one of Christianity Today's. Matter of fact, it was Book of the Year in 2016. Onward, Engaging the Culture Without Losing the Gospel. Also, of course, I might mention some of the others. Adopted for Life: The Priority of Adoption for Christian Families and Churches, and Tempted and Tried. Temptation and Triumph of Christ, a couple of others, but this is the latest book, and it is Storm-Tossed Family, How the Cross Reshapes the Home, and it's published by our friends at B&H Publishing, and I appreciate you being with us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's take a break, and when we come back tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition, this will be an opportunity for you to join with us, and there are just a lot of questions that we have on the table. Right now, as I mentioned, Judge Brett Kavanaugh is still testifying, so trying to sort all of that out with the testimony that was heard earlier by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, and then, of course, the other allegations from Deborah Ramirez as well as Julie Swednick are certainly the case. If you haven't been with me in the outset, I have said many times that I tend to believe both of these individuals, and people say, no, somebody's got to be lying. No, not necessarily. I think it is quite possible that there could be the possibility of mistaken identity. We do have two individuals that I think they're going to talk about this in just a few minutes in the Senate Judiciary Committee, two men who say that they were the ones in the disputed encounter with Christina Blasey Ford. I don't know if that's true or not. I know that the Senate Judiciary Committee members have tried to interview them and see if that is the case. So that's one possibility. There's another possibility as well of false memories, and we'll get into that in a little more detail tomorrow. But we've quoted from Elizabeth Loftus, who has identified, just in the work she's done, 300 people in the United States who have gone to prison for crimes that they did not commit. Many of these were alleged rapes, and yet 3/4 of those were the result of false memories of the accuser. So again, trying to pull all of that together, important to try to figure out. And of course, we'll see whether or not there's veracity to the things that Judge Brett Kavanaugh has to say. So we'll try to sort some of that out tomorrow, but most importantly, then we'll see where the Senate Judiciary Committee goes in terms of a vote, whether or not he is voted out of the Senate Judiciary Committee or defeated, or even if he is voted out, how he stands before the Senate itself. So those are issues still to be decided. And don't forget, we haven't even mentioned today that the president has been meeting with the Deputy Attorney General, and that's all happening today as well. So we've got a lot to cover tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition. So let's postpone those discussions till tomorrow. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
From Universal 1440 comes Unbroken, Path to Redemption. Based on the best-selling book telling the rest of the true story of Olympian and World War II hero Louis Zamperini.
Tonight, there's a drowning man just looking for some type of hope for the future. But there's a lifeline. Just reach out.
Unbroken, Path to Redemption. Rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. Now playing. More information is available at unbrokenfilm.com.
You don't become an Olympian without investing all you've got. You don't become a war hero without putting it all on the line. Those who leave a mark on this world demonstrate they believe in something greater than themselves, a purpose, a cause. In a time of fake news, the need for solid information is perhaps greater than ever. Bring truth to the nation by joining the Truth Team at Point of View. Our cause needs heroes like you. Demonstrate what you believe. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.